Hello, everybody, and welcome to Heated, a podcast that exists to deprogram your brain from polluter propaganda. Today, we're going to cover a controversial topic, electric vehicles. Now, if you don't really know me, you might expect me to be like, oh my God, electric vehicles are amazing. They are the solution to everything. And that is not what I'm going to say at all. In fact, in my many years of trying to sort out fact from fiction as a reporter, what I can tell you confidently is this. Anyone who attempts to promote black and white thinking about electric cars is probably not telling you the truth. Unfortunately, the internet is full of black and white thinking. It's either electric cars are good and gas cars are bad, or gas cars are good and electric cars are bad. But here's the truth. When it comes to the environment, there is no such thing as a good car. Electric cars and gas cars are both bad for the environment in their own ways. The real question we need to figure out is, how bad are electric cars and gas cars in relation to each other? This is where most EV misinformation lies. So in today's episode, we're going to go over some of the most common myths about EVs and the massive profit-driven motives behind those myths. Then we're going to talk to an environmental psychologist who studies EV misinformation to figure out why so many people latch on to these myths and what can be done to stop the problem. We're going to start our conversation today with our producer, Tracy Wolf. Tracy, you've been a climate and environmental journalist for just as long as I have, over 10 years. What has been your experience covering electric cars?
Gosh, well, I was always doing this for a lot of broadcast television news networks. And so there were more EV stories than I ever had the time and energy and resources to cover, because we were oftentimes asked to do stories about the latest and greatest EV models. And, there was a time there where they were, so tricked out on technology that was a very popular story. I even got pitched one time by General Motors because they were trying to show how EVs could power your home if you lost power during like an extreme weather event. I thought that one was actually pretty cool.
Yeah, so it's not like you're just doing environment stories about that. There's this whole broadcast component of tricked out EVs, get an EV.
Well, I mean, they're inherently super visual, right? So it was a story for TV. But I would say the one that came across my desk the most was, ooh, can we tell the story about which car is actually better for the environment? Gas,
all right,
batteries. And every single year, I swear to God, I know we would have to, debunk that one.
Well, okay, so what did you find? When you did the stories about are EVs really green, what did you tend to report?
Well, it is not a black and white answer, right? To your point, what we've already discussed is that cars in general and inherently are already damaging to the environment. And so we oftentimes had to have that discussion, or we did that investigation around critical minerals and how they're sourced. And you can't hide from that reality. I mean, the reality is to build EVs requires 6 times the mineral input by weight of conventional vehicles, excluding the steel and aluminum. So, yeah, I'm not the only one who's done this story. I know you have done it a lot too.
Okay, so you said to build an EV, it requires 6 times the mineral input by weight of conventional vehicles of gas-powered cars.
Yeah.
Excluding the steel and aluminum. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a really big one that I was covering when I did my guide to electric car misinformation. That was absolutely the most prominent claim I had to tackle, was that because electric cars require so much more minerals to make than gas-powered cars, that means that they're actually worse for the climate.
Okay, but are they actually worse? Is it true?
Well, it's not true, specifically because the biggest environmental impact of a car is not making the car. It's driving the car. So if you're just buying a car to park it in your driveway and admire it forever, then yes, an electric car would be worse for the climate than a gas-powered car. But most people are not doing that. I mean, maybe there are celebrities that are doing that. If I remember from MTV Cribs, there are definitely people who just buy a car to look at their car. Or maybe buy it once and let air.
Right? Jay Leno has a whole barrage of cars that he just looks at, right?
Correct. I assume. I'm really not up to date on Jay Leno's, but most people are driving their car all the time. So if you're actually going to drive your car, the electric vehicle is the cleaner choice, even if the electricity that powers the battery of that car comes from coal.
Okay, but how do we know that?
I'm not just making it up, fortunately. So when I was doing this guide to electric car misinformation, I looked up a bunch of research, tried to figure out what was the most credible. And I found two pretty good studies. One was a peer-reviewed paper from the University of Michigan published in 2022. That study was literally funded by Ford, which makes most of its money selling gas cars. So I thought normally that's, you would expect a study funded by a gas car maker to find that gas cars are better, but that's not what it found. It found that EVs pay back their higher manufacturing emissions in about a year and a half of driving. So the EV starts out worse for the climate, right? But in about a year and a half of typical driving, it surpasses that.
Mhm.
So after that, EVs are cleaner than gas cars for the rest of their lives. And most people have their car for more than a year and a half. So that was one study. And then there's another study by Ricardo PLC, which is an energy consulting firm. Now, this one was not peer reviewed, but it found that it only takes 19,000 miles for an electric car to become more climate friendly than a gas car. And that's even when the electricity comes partially from coal. So they looked at a whole different bunch of electricity mixes, because some people will say, like, I'm sure you've heard this. Some people will say that if the energy that powers the battery came from a coal plant, it's worse than gas.
I think it's interesting here because I feel like this is a common thread with a lot of climate solutions or adaptation solutions is that you have to invest more initially, but the long-term payoffs are exponentially better than kind of our traditional fossil fueled options. So I just wanted to point that out. But that's not to say that we shouldn't just ignore the environmental harms of mining, right? Like that's not what we're saying
Right.
here. I mean, the impacts of mining, which are horrible from both an environmental and human rights level, are still happening.
Yes. And that sort of goes back to the point that we both made in the beginning of the show, which is that, like, they're both bad. There's always these arguments that are like trying to get you to think that one is really bad and the other one is good. And that I think is really, like I said earlier, where the heart of EV misinformation is. They're both bad. What we're trying to figure out is which one is worse. And to your point earlier, where you were talking about, a lot of these climate solutions have a higher upfront cost environmentally, but over time, that environmental impact drops. Part of that is because things like battery minerals can be recycled.
Yeah. And recycling of battery minerals is growing immensely. The largest battery recycling company in the United States, Redwood Materials, which is out in Nevada, it's expanding. They're even using old EV batteries to build out storage solutions. Huge companies are making investments in them, like Google. So I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in that space. But building out battery and mineral tech recycling, it can help us build that true circular economy for technology. So, yes, we all agree here EVs have a footprint. But if someone tells you that that mineral footprint makes them worse for the climate than gas cars, that's just not what the data shows.
Well, because the thing about gas is that you burn it and then it's gone. It is an endless cycle of mining, right? But there is no promise for recycling with gasoline, right? Like there cannot be a promise for recycling gasoline.
No, no,
It's an endless cycle.
not the way it works. Emily, I'm curious, like, what other EV myths have you debunked in your newsletter in the past?
Okay, so I wrote this whole guide to EV misinformation. It's actually a two-part guide, and it goes over some of the myths about EVs in general, and then some of the more political myths, like about EV policy. And I will link to that newsletter in the show notes so that people can read through it more fully. It would take us forever to go through every single one. But the other really big one we should probably talk about is that EVs are more likely to catch on fire than gas cars.
Not only is it popular on television, like even today, I was going through some news alerts and yes, another EV fire that was very hard for the local fire department to put out. Like probably the most common story that we see all the time. And it's true. It's really hard to put out an EV car fire. So what did you find when you debunked it?
So it's so interesting because those EV fire videos are crazy. But the short answer is that EVs are still way, way less likely to actually catch fire than a gas car. And in retrospect, that is kind of obvious when you think about it, because gas cars are literally powered by tiny explosions of fire. So obviously, the one that is full of gas and powered by explosions is more likely to catch fire. So that's anecdotally obvious, but that is not, again, what I relied on to make this claim, right? A couple countries have looked into it.
Yeah.
So Norway looked into it, and that's because they have the world's highest proportion of electric car sales.
I know.
And they found that there's still between 4 and 5 times more fires in gas and diesel cars than in EVs. So I thought that was really interesting. The other country that looked into this was Australia, and they found that there is a 0.0012% chance of an electric vehicle battery catching fire compared to a 0.1% chance for a gas car to catch fire.
Okay, so we're talking lots of points. I mean, it seems like there's a pretty low chance of a fire happening in either type of car.
Yes, obviously 0.1% chance of your gas car catching fire is very low, and a 0.0012 chance of your EV catching fire is extremely low. So both very low, but 0.1 is way bigger than 0.0012.
Yeah.
Orders of magnitude bigger.
So to your point, with the percentage being so low and the obvious point that like a gas-powered car is more likely to combust because it's powered by gas, why do you think so many people continue to believe this myth that EVs are more likely to catch fire?
It's probably because of the best videos of fires from EV. I mean, the EV fires that break out are pretty crazy. And I guess if you're thinking to yourself, okay, yeah, my gas car might catch fire, but it'll be a smaller fire than this EV fire, right? It's true that the EV fires do require more water to put out.
Right.
And they can burn almost 3 times hotter, and they're more likely to reignite. My thing about this is that if your car catches on fire, you're fucked. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah. I would just say though too, I think part of the problem is we are accustomed to cars catching on fire for decades, right? Like we are used to seeing car fires. I've driven by them on the highway in the past and it never like really struck me one way or the other. And I think the issue with EV car fires is they are these like bigger, they are hotter, they are harder to contain. They're more of a novelty at the moment. And so I think it's just leaving a different impression on people's brains than the typical car fires that we are so accustomed to. But why do you think people continue to talk about these things? Why do you think it continues to be a problem in people's minds?
It's a great question. I don't know. Come
on.
Well, I don't know it, but I do know somebody who does. Our guest today is Dr. Chris Breder. He's an environmental psychologist who led a 2025 study seeking to figure out how pervasive EV myths really are, why people believe them, and most importantly, what can be done to stop them. Welcome to the show, Chris. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So you're an environmental psychologist.
Yes.
What is that?
That's a very good question. So I guess the broadest question that I can phrase as to what I'm doing every day is to look at or to ask, why do people behave environmentally friendly and why others don't? And how can we make those that don't behave more environmentally friendly in the future?
So you studied how actual human people feel or think about electric vehicles. Tell me a little bit about the questions that you were really interested in asking and why you wanted to study how people view electric vehicles.
So we know electric vehicles are a big part of the transition to sustainable society. But we also know that the adoption hasn't been great. And we also know that there is a lot of misinformation out there, driven by several institutions, that sort of spread misinformation about electric vehicles. And that might be part of the reason why the adoption has been fairly slow. So with this work, we were just really interested in how much of this misinformation that is out there actually sticks in people's mind. In other words, how much do actually people believe in that sort of stuff? So we tested a range of different myths and checked how many people believe in those.
Give us the quick rundown. Who did you survey? What did you ask them? And what did you find?
So basically, we sent out a survey in 4 different countries, one in the US, then in Germany, Austria, and Australia. And we basically asked people about their endorsement of 9 myths of electric vehicles. And then, on the standard scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, their endorsement. And what we basically found is that of all of the responses across the country, so 4,000 individuals, over a third, so 36% of responses were in agreement with myths that are demonstrably false or at least misleading according to latest and best available scientific evidence. So more than a third of people believe in things that are clearly wrong.
Like what?
Such as one of the biggest myths, I guess, that is out there is that electric vehicles are actually worse for the environment because of their production process. So we had 2 statements about sort of the emission intensity of the production process in those items, but also items such as electric vehicles are more likely than petrol cars to catch fire, which is again wrong. So, these are clearly items that are circulating in the media and that people believe, unfortunately.
Wait, so more than a third of people believe that EVs are worse for the environment than gas.
So yes, so that particular statement, that varies a bit by country, but let's say around a third of people actually agree with that statement, that the manufacturing of electric vehicles, due to the emission intensity of that process, which is true, by the way, but that these emissions that are caused during the production process outweigh the benefit of the electric vehicle later on.
How many people believe that EVs are more likely to catch fire?
Yeah, this was actually the most endorsed piece of misinformation. And if I'm not remembering incorrectly, it's 50% at least in each country of responses were in agreement with that statement. So half of the people surveyed.
Damn. We're very successful at this. Are there any other big claims that you found were pretty rampant?
I think we measured also various claims alongside the sort of negative health effects of electric vehicles, sort of with the magnetic fields and stuff like this. And these were actually the least endorsed items, but still sort of around 20% of people endorsed a claim that electric vehicles lead to bad health outcomes such as cancer due to the electromagnetic fields. And that again has been sort of disproven by research. But still 20% is still a lot of people.
I hadn't
Yeah.
even heard that one. What? Wait. Okay. I'm like, I don't even know if I want to get into this. What is that? So like the electric car battery is emanating some sort of electromagnetic field that's giving us.
And it does emit electromagnetic fields, but they are not strong enough to cause, at least according to research, any sort of negative health outcomes for either birds or us as humans. But yeah, so people actually believe that 20% of people believe that electric vehicles can give cancer due to the electromagnetic field.
To birds? Did you say birds?
Yeah, well, there was another statement, electromagnetic fields harm birds when you drive by on some places. So that was another statement they asked, and 20% of people believe that as well.
Why are people all of a sudden pretending to care about birds? Like, it's like the windmills thing. It's like all of a sudden the people that never cared about birds in their whole life are like, the windmills are killing birds. And now they're like, the electric cars are killing birds. Anyway, how do people's beliefs actually impact the reality that we're seeing on the road? Did you get any information about how much these beliefs impact people's buying of cars or people's support for policy, anything like that?
Yeah, so we looked at the correlation between people's endorsement of misinformation and their support for pro-electric vehicle policies, and also their intentions to buy an electric vehicle in the future. And there was always a negative correlation, meaning that the more people endorse misinformation, the less they are pro-EV policies, and they less they intend to buy an electric vehicle in the future. It is important to mention that these 4,000 people were all non-EV owners. So these people didn't have an electric vehicle at the time of the survey. However, we repeated the survey just in the US though, with a sample of, I think, 2,000 people, where we then split the sample between 50% owned already an electric vehicle and 50% did not. And what we found was contrary to what we expected, I guess, namely that there is no difference in misinformation endorsement between people who already own an electric vehicle and people who do not. Because you would expect that once you own an electric vehicle, basically you've done your research and you know that the kinds of stuff are misinformation. But this is not the case. So EV owners do still believe in those misinformation, in these myths.
Do you get any more information about why that is?
So we have to speculate on this. And one reason might be that once you own an electric vehicle, and for example, you tell your friends, oh, I just bought an electric vehicle, then you might be more susceptible to discourse and to sort of basically misinformation, right? So then imagine you go, you're on a garden party and then your friend tells you, oh, but electric vehicles are much more likely to catch fire than petrol cars. Did you know that? And then these things start to stick maybe. So that might be one possible explanation. We cannot know for sure because we didn't test this, but that's one possible reason, that people become more sensitized once they own an electric vehicle.
Did you get into all about why people believe that?
Yeah, so we then looked at the factors that influence people's basically endorsement of misinformation. And one of the largest predictor of why people believe in misinformation is what's called a conspiracy mentality. And this is basically the systemic mistrust of elites. So people who are more mistrusting of elites, more suspicious of what government officials are doing behind closed doors, what organizations are doing behind closed doors, people who are more suspicious of those institutions, for example, have, or on average, tend to agree more or endorse to a stronger extent such misinformation statements, along with other factors such as political ideology, conservative political ideology, and other factors. Interestingly, education, though, and scientific literacy didn't play any role whatsoever. And that's, again, contrary to what many people would believe. So it's not that these people are uneducated. It is simply that ideologies are taking over.
That's interesting. So it's not like people are stupid. It's not like people are believing stuff because they haven't read a book or, we're not paying attention. They're paying attention. But what do you mean by conspiracy mindset? Can you talk a little bit more about that? So you're saying like people who are more likely to have a conspiracy mindset.
Yeah. So a conspiracy mindset is basically the mistrust towards people and institutions of power. And basically it refers to the fact that people believe that what is told as an official story by, for example, the government or institution is not really the full truth. And that's fueled by past experiences. I mean, there were some conspiracy theories in the past, in the last decades, that came out to be true. And yeah, so this basically mindset of sort of distrusting elites, distrusting people in power is particularly associated with misinformation endorsement, which is quite interesting, because what makes this particularly dangerous is that this distrust has been shown in the past to be very difficult to be addressed, because you can't just go to a person and say, look, this is not really, this is a conspiracy what you're believing in, or you should be more trusting of people of power. Because there are instances, obviously, where people in power abuse that power as well. So it's not sort of, yeah. So it's quite difficult actually to address that.
Well, it's so interesting because I hear you describe a conspiracy mindset and I'm like, oh, so me? Absolutely distrust.
And it's not, I think it's as well to remember that this is not a binary thing, right? It's not either you have it or you don't have it. It's sort of a continuum. We are all somewhere on the spectrum of conspiracy mentality. It just depends on if you are stronger on that spectrum. So if you have a stronger conspiracy mentality, odds are you also believe to a stronger extent in misinformation about electric vehicles.
So what is the best way to make all this stop? What have you found, if anything, can be done to lessen this?
So we basically tested 2 interventions on how can we, if at all, reduce misinformation endorsement about electric vehicles. And basically what we've done, we've taken an experiment, we've taken 1,500 people and allocated a third of them to a condition where they interacted with ChatGPT around 3 rounds about electric vehicles. So as if you would ChatGPT, as if you would normally use ChatGPT. So basically they had 3 rounds of interaction with ChatGPT about electric vehicles. And a second condition, we just gave them a fact sheet of the US Department of Energy, sort of like a myth-busting fact sheet. And in the third condition, people just interacted with ChatGPT about sports. So that was sort of the control condition where we didn't expect any sort of effects. And we found that both the fact sheet condition and the ChatGPT condition where people interacted with ChatGPT about electric vehicles resulted in lower endorsement of misinformation compared to the control condition, roughly 10%, if I'm not mistaken. And that's stuck across a period of 10 days. So 10 days later, we invited the same people again and asked them again, oh, how much do you endorse these pieces of misinformation? And the effects were still there. So meaning potentially, this is just obviously a preliminary study, potentially ChatGPT or a fact sheet are quite effective in reducing endorsement of misinformation. And that lasts at least for 10 days.
Not sure how comfortable I am that like chatbots are the solution to this.
Yeah, I know. That's a very sort of interesting question that we asked. You would think actually that there's a lot of, again, probably I guess assumption out there, or at least gut feel, I would say, that people say, oh, but what if ChatGPT also provides misinformation and stuff like that? And we actually done a number of studies on that, and also the existing research doesn't support this at all, at least from what I can see, that ChatGPT actually spreads misinformation. So it was actually quite good in, I guess, almost better as humans sometimes, in having empathy with people, saying like, look, you may believe that electric vehicles are more likely to catch fire. I understand where you're coming from, but have you thought about these sources here? And the scientific evidence doesn't say that.
Wow.
So it's very empathetic in it doesn't judge almost, almost like so yeah, it's very, very clever in doing that.
Maybe the answer, and tell me if I'm, taking too far of a leap here scientifically, but if ChatGPT has the ability to deprogram people's brains, or at least like make them think differently because it tends to be empathetic, maybe the answer is like more empathetic communication, not treating people as idiots for believing things that are necessarily wrong, because your research has shown that it's not because people are idiots.
Exactly. 100% I agree with you. Yeah. I think in general, people who believe in misinformation and yeah, I think we need to be more empathetic with them, and not just because if you tell them that they're basically stupid, borders come up and then you will never get to these people again.
Totally. And that's helpful for me too as a reporter, because, I've been doing this for a long time, debunking misinformation for a long time, and sometimes it gets frustrating, and I'm a little snarky lady. So sometimes when I'm debunking, I'll be like, I'll have this tone about me that's a little eye rolly, like, can you believe people believe
Yeah.
this after so long? And it's probably pretty off-putting. So it's a good reminder that like the research shows that I should stop being such a bitch.
That's well put. Yeah. I just want having empathy with people, right? And not assuming that they're stupid, basically, just because they believe in certain of these things. And remember, there's always a small kernel of truth to it as well, right? That, doesn't mean that all of it is true, but there's a certain element of it which is true if you look at it in isolation.
Absolutely. And it also makes me think about, I have friends that believe things that I think are misinformation, specifically about, let's say, vaccines, etc. Right? When I speak to them, I always have empathy. I always relate. I am never eye rolly, like, oh my God, like, stop.
Yeah.
Right? I think maybe what your research is saying to me as a communicator is speak to people as if you would speak to your friends. It
Yeah.
goes a long way. Computer is doing better at that than you are.
Yeah. And one of the reasons might be because you have a history with your friends, right? You know where they're coming from, you know what they've been through, and these type of things. Whereas
I
if you
know that
see
that's
if you see a person on the street maybe who just, says a statement like this, you just roll your eyes because you don't know anything about it. So you don't know why that person actually believes in that stuff, right? Everyone has a story, I guess. So having empathy, I think, is important.
Chris, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
He is so interested. Like, obviously, study looks at the totality of respondents across these 4 countries. But when you broke it down by country, I'm just curious. Americans believe some of these myths at a higher percentage. Are we gullible? Because from Emily and my perspective, like, we live here, it certainly feels there's nobody else in the world that's believing this stuff like we are. And I'm just curious, what did you find between the countries?
So statistically, if you analyze statistically, there was no significant difference between the countries. That doesn't mean that for isolated items there isn't a difference. So, for example, for the item with electric vehicles are more likely to catch fire, people in Germany and Austria, if I'm not mistaken, so the German-speaking countries, and they were much more likely to believe that, or a higher percentage of the responses were in agreement with that particular myth than in the US. interestingly enough, for example, right?
Well, this was very informative. Thank you for joining us, Chris. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks for having me. That was amazing.
All right, that's it for today's show, everybody. We are a new show, so if you liked what you heard and you want to hear more stuff like it, please share it with a friend. Spread the word. We need you.
We'd also love to hear from you. So please go ahead, check out the Substack Heated and subscribe to us, drop some comments, or find Heated and Emily on all the social channels.
Except X. I'm not really on X.
Yeah, I'm on X, but I refuse to engage there. But, all the other social channels, please find us there. Drop us a note.
Yes, and we've got some more conspiracy-laced episodes on the horizon, trying to debunk some myths and all that. So we've also got a few big interviews on the way. So continue to follow us, and we will see you soon.